The Last Passenger. The year was 1688, and the small, desolate village of Black Hollow sat shrouded in an eternal mist. The air carried an eerie chill, whispering tales of forgotten souls and unspeakable horrors. Few dared venture out after dusk, for the villagers swore by the stories of a spectral train that appeared only under the cover of midnight. Its whistle, a low, mournful sound, was said to have echoed through the hills, luring unsuspecting souls into a journey from which none returned. Jozef Whitmore, a devout Christian and a struggling farmer, had heard the tales many times. Yet, desperation overshadowed his fear. His wife, Eleanor, lay bedridden with a mysterious illness, and the local healer had given up hope. Rumors spoke of a distant town where miraculous cures were found, and Jozef, clutching at straws, decided to risk the journey. That night, as the village clock struck 11, Jozef kissed his wife's pale forehead, whispered a prayer, and set out toward the deserted train station on the edge of Black Hollow. The station was a relic of the past, long abandoned, with ivy and moss devouring its wooden beams. An oil lantern flickered weakly by the station master's booth, though no station master had been seen there for decades. The tracks gleamed faintly under the pale moonlight, stretching into an infinite abyss. Jozef pulled his coat tight against the wind, and the breath he exhaled formed misty clouds in the air. The silence was oppressive until suddenly, a distant whistle shattered the stillness. His heart was racing as a spectral light emerged from the horizon, cutting through the fog. The train appeared, old and otherworldly, its black iron frame shining as if it had been forged from shadows. Smoke was billowing from its engine, an acrid stench that made Jozef's stomach churn. The train came to a halt before him, and a single door creaked open. Flickering dim gas lamps cast a sickly yellow glow over worn-out seats and faded wallpaper. A conductor emerged from the carriage, dressed in a tattered uniform. His face was as pale as ash, his eyes sunken and empty. "Destination?" the conductor asked in a hollow echo. "Raven's Crest," he stuttered, naming the town where he hoped to find a cure for Eleanor. The conductor handed him a brittle yellowed ticket without a word. Jozef hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but the thought of Eleanor's frail body pushed him forward. He stepped into the carriage, and the door slammed shut behind him with a finality that sent shivers down his spine. The carriage was only sparsely occupied, but every passenger seemed wrapped in their own mystery. An old woman clutched a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. A gaunt man in a tattered suit stared blankly out the window, though what lay outside the window was nothing but impenetrable darkness. Jozef sat down beside the middle seat, the air around him heavy with an unexplainable sense of fear. He held his Bible tightly, whispering Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." But his words were cut off as he realized the other passengers were turning to look at him. Their faces were pale, their eyes flashing with a strange, unnatural light. A cold hand gripped his shoulder, and he turned to see the conductor looming over him. "Tickets, please," the conductor said, his skeletal hand outstretched. Jozef handed over his ticket, and as the conductor inspected it, his lips curled into a sinister smile. "You've chosen a one-way journey, Mr. Whitmore," the conductor murmured before disappearing into the shadows of the next carriage. As the train picked up speed, the landscape outside became a swirling vortex of shadows. Jozef could feel the carriage shudder in his hands as whispers swirled through the air. They spoke in languages he could not understand, but the tone was chillingly certain of doom. "What is this place?" he whispered to himself. "You don't belong here," a voice rasped beside him. He turned to see the elderly woman clutching her rosary. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her hands trembled as she gestured toward the end of the carriage. "It's not too late. Leave before the final stop." The train had just jerked violently before she could ask him what he meant when she vanished. On the seat lay her rosary, with beads blackened as if scorched. Jozef's fear grew as he walked towards the next carriage, hoping to find answers. The door creaked open to reveal an opulent interior, starkly different from the dilapidated carriages he had seen before. The walls were adorned with golden filigree, and chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a ghostly glow. At the center stood a large mirror, its surface rippling like water. Jozef approached cautiously, his reflection distorted and grotesque. "Jozef Whitmore," a voice boomed from the mirror. "You seek salvation, but what will you sacrifice to attain it?" Before he could respond, the mirror shattered, and a deafening scream filled the air. The carriage plunged into darkness, and Jozef felt himself being pulled backward by an unseen force. Jozef opened his eyes, his body drenched in sweat. The train was quiet once more, but the passengers were gone. He was alone. The conductor returned, this time his face a hollow skull, and gave Jozef a map. It was blank except for a single word written in blood: sacrifice. "Prepare yourself, Mr. Whitmore," the conductor said. "The journey has only just begun." Again the train's whistle screamed and the carriage had plunged into an abyss of darkness, leaving Jozef shivering with fear. The air inside the train had turned heavier, almost suffocating. Jozef sat frozen in his seat, holding the blood-stained map in trembling hands. The word sacrifice seemed to burn in his brain like a cursed brand. The once faint whispers now roared louder and louder, filling the carriage with overlapping voices speaking in fragmented words to weave a web of fear around him. The train rattled violently, throwing Jozef forward. He steadied himself, only to find the map glowing faintly in the dim light. Lines and markings began to etch themselves onto its blank surface, forming a route that seemed impossible to decipher. "Where are you taking me?" he muttered under his breath. The conductor reappeared, stepping out of the shadows as if summoned by Jozef's fear. His hollow eyes gleamed faintly, and his skeletal fingers tapped the map. "You asked the wrong question," the conductor rasped. "It's not where you're going, but why you're here that matters." Jozef wanted to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. The conductor leaned closer, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "The truth lies at the end of the line, but truth demands sacrifice. Are you prepared to pay the price, Mr. Whitmore?" He didn't have time to answer. The train was screeching to a halt in a sound like a scream through the void. Outside his window, he saw nothing but a flat wasteland that stretched out before him, under an unhealthy greenish light. A station sign read, "Ashen Hollow, 1682. Confused, Jozef squinted at the sign. What was he doing in 1682 if he had started on that train in 1688? Panic clawed at his chest, but his morbid curiosity overrode his dread. The door creaked open to reveal a jagged path toward a decrepit church at the edge of this wasteland. The otherworldly stillness within the train urged him forward. Unseen forces seemed to want him to step out into the air. Jozef trudged towards the church. The air grew colder with every step. The building loomed before him, its crooked spire piercing the unnatural sky. Its wooden doors were ajar, revealing a flickering light within. As Jozef entered, he was struck by the eerie sight of an empty, pew-lined hall. Candles burned on the altar, their flames unnaturally steady despite the draft that howled through the broken windows. A single figure knelt before the altar, a young woman in a tattered white dress. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed quietly, her hair cascading over her face like a curtain of shadows. "Miss?" Jozef called out hesitantly. The woman turned slowly, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the candlelight. Her eyes were hollow sockets, black as the void. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not ready." "Ready for what?" Jozef asked, his heart pounding. She didn't answer. She merely raised a trembling hand and pointed to the altar. Upon it rested a small, rusted box. Its lid was slightly ajar. "Your sacrifice begins here," she said, and her voice echoed unnaturally. Jozef crept forward with trepidation, his heartbeat thumping in his head. Nearing the box, a shivering fear gripped him. The whispers came again, but this time, louder and clearer. "Don't open it," one of the voices whispered. "You have to," said another. He faltered, but his hand was shaking as he stretched it toward the box. When his skin made contact with it, a burning pain went down his palm, and the box slammed shut. A vision seized him, blinding and vivid. He beheld Eleanor, his wife, stretching out on her bed, her white face twisted into knots of pain. She reached up, her lips moving mutely as the tears streamed down. Over her shoulder loomed the vague shape of a figure. Outstretched was its hand for her throat. "No!" Jozef yelled and clutched tighter on the box. The vision ran away from him. His breath was gone from him. The woman in white stood beside him now, her face unreadable. "Every choice you make will cost you something, Jozef. What are you willing to give to save her?" Jozef stumbled backward toward the train, clutching the rusted box. The woman's words echoed in his mind as he climbed aboard. To his shock, the once empty carriage was now filled with passengers again. They were the same faces as before, but something was different about them. Their skin was now paler, their eyes hollow. They looked at him as if they knew something he didn't. The old woman with the rosary leaned forward. "Did you take it?" she whispered almost inaudibly. Jozef nodded hesitantly. "You've made your choice," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Now the train won't stop until it has what it wants." "What does it want?" Jozef asked, his voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she dissolved into smoke, leaving behind her blackened rosary. The train bucked like an animal as it lurched forward once again. Lights stuttered, illuminating sections of the car with stark bursts of light followed by almost smothering darkness. Jozef clutched the metal box, feeling it become even more substantial. Windows in the car walls began to warp. Glass cracked as if from unseen pressure. The whispers erupted into a screech that was unendurable, and Jozef fell forward onto his knees, placing his hands over his ears. "Stop it!" he shouted. The noise stopped suddenly, and there was a deafening silence. When Jozef looked up, he found himself alone again. The carriage was in ruins, the seats overturned and the walls crumbling. Only the rusted box remained intact, glowing faintly in the darkness. The conductor reappeared, stepping over the debris with an unsettling calm. He held out his hand, and Jozef reluctantly handed over the box. The conductor opened it, and in the center of the page lay a lone black feather. "The first offering," he said, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "But there is much more to give, Mr. Whitmore. Much more." Jozef's eyes went wide as the conductor pulled a blood-stained envelope from his coat and handed it over to Jozef, who with shaking hands pulled it open to reveal inside it a photograph of Eleanor, hollow-eyed, lifeless as the other passengers. "She's already on the train," the conductor said with a cruel smile. "Do you have what it takes to save her?" Just as Jozef was about to answer, the train went black again, its whistle echoing as some final cry of despair. The train hurtled into the darkness, the wheels squeaking like souls tormented to screaming despair against the rail tracks. Jozef sat silently clutching the blood-stained photograph of Eleanor. Lifeless and empty eyes looked back at him. They seemed to be drawing him into an abyss of misery and remorse. The conductor had vanished once more, leaving Jozef alone in the crumbling remnants of the carriage. The glow of the rusted box still lingered faintly in the air, an oppressive reminder of the sacrifice he had unwillingly begun. The whispers returned, softer this time, yet more insidious. They slithered into his mind, their words like venom. "She's already gone. You'll never save her. It's all your fault." "No!" Jozef cried out, his voice cracking. He pounded his fist into the wall of the carriage, the pain grounding him momentarily. "I will save her. I will do whatever it takes." As if responding, the train jolted violently and a blinding light filled the carriage. When the light faded, Jozef was in a completely different location. The train had stopped at another station, but this one was unlike the barren wasteland of Ashen Hollow. It was a bustling marketplace, full of activity. Vendors shouted over one another, peddling wares that shimmered unnaturally in the dim light of the lanterns hanging above. The station sign read, "The Crimson Bazaar, 1685. Jozef stepped out cautiously, taking short breaths. It filled the air with spices and smoke, but something's all wrong with the people around. Their movements jerky, facial surfaces like masks of overhanging flesh. "Stay on the path," a voice murmurs in his ear. He looks around sharply, but he knows no one is nearby. A narrow cobblestone road lay ahead, weaving through the marketplace and toward a large pavilion in the distance. The roof of the pavilion was wrapped in crimson fabric, and beneath it, a crowd had gathered. As Jozef approached the pavilion, the crowd parted, allowing him to step inside. There stood a tall figure, draped in a black cloak, which seemed to absorb all light. "Welcome to the Crimson Bazaar," the figure declared, its voice echoing unnaturally. "Tonight we auction not trinkets or treasures, but what lies beyond the veil of mortality: souls." Jozef's stomach churned. He wanted to run, but his legs would not move. He saw in horror as the figure raised its hand, revealing a glowing orb. Inside the orb, a face pressed against the surface, screaming silently. "This one," the figure said, "is from a man who thought he could cheat death." A valiant effort, but futile nonetheless. The crowd applauded, their hollow faces twisted in grotesque glee. "Next," the figure continued, "we have a special offering." It turned to Jozef, and the crowd's focus moved to him. A soul yet to be claimed, teetering on the edge of damnation. "Step forward, Mr. Whitmore." Jozef hesitated and did not want to obey, yet he felt compelled. The figure gestured toward a pedestal placed at the middle of the stage. On the pedestal lay a small mirror, dark with swirling shadows. "Look into the mirror," the figure commanded. Jozef stepped closer, his reflection slowly coming into view. But what he saw wasn't his own face, it was Eleanor's. She was screaming, her mouth open in a silent wail of agony. Shadowy hands clawed at her from the darkness, dragging her deeper into an abyss. "No!" Jozef cried out, reaching for the mirror. Ah, he said, raising a skeletal finger. "Saving her costs. What is it you will give for her life, Mr. Whitmore?" Jozef thought fast. "What do you want?" The skeleton's wide smile grew. "The memories you have of her, all of them." Jozef fell back. "No. What am I saving her for without my memories?" "Exactly," the figure said coldly. "True sacrifice is letting go. Do you love her more than remembering her?" Jozef looked into the mirror, his soul crushed under the weight of the decision. Eleanor's tortured face stared back, her silent screams tearing at his soul. His voice broke. "I can't do it." The cloaked figure's expression darkened. "Then she remains lost, and the train moves on." "No!" Jozef shouted. "Wait!" The figure paused, its hollow eyes glinting with amusement. "Have you changed your mind?" Jozef clenched fists. "Take part of my memory. Leave enough so that I remember why I do this." The figure appeared to debate the notion for a few moments. "A compromise. Very well." It reached out, its icy fingers on Jozef's forehead. He felt searing pain as fragments of his memories were ripped away. He saw flashes of Eleanor, her laughter, their wedding, the way her hand felt in his. Each memory vanished into the void, leaving behind a hollow ache. When the pain subsided, Jozef collapsed to the ground. The mirror shattered, and Eleanor's face faded from its surface. "Your debt is paid," the figure said. "For now." Jozef stumbled back toward the train, his head throbbing. The marketplace was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. The train stood waiting, its open door like a gaping maw. He climbed aboard, collapsing into a seat. The carriage was whole again, but the passengers were different. They stared at him with accusing eyes, their whispers filled with disdain. "You should have saved her," someone whispered. "You are not strong enough," another hissed. Jozef hid his face in his hands, unable to breathe from the weight of his decisions. The train continued forward, an iron beast hacking through the infinite chasm. Each shriek of its wheels was like a scream of anguish echoing in Jozef's ears. He sat in the dimly lit carriage, staring out of the cracked window. Outside, the world was a vast expanse of blackness, as if the train was traveling through nothingness itself. The oppressive silence of the passengers was broken only by their occasional whispers, low, insidious, and dripping with malice. "You can't win. She's already lost. Why do you fight the inevitable?" Jozef gritted his teeth and closed his eyes, holding the photograph of Eleanor that now felt heavier in his hands. Her face, once so vivid in his mind, was beginning to blur. Pieces of his memories had been torn away in the Crimson Bazaar, leaving behind fragmented images that felt more like a cruel illusion than a cherished past. The train lurched violently, throwing Jozef to the floor. He scrambled to his feet as a figure stepped into the end carriage from the door. It was the conductor, or at least something wearing his uniform. The figure was taller than before, its frame unnaturally elongated. Its face was obscured by shadows, and its voice echoed with a haunting distortion. "We reached the 4th stop, Mr. Whitmore," it intoned, its voice flat and uninflected. "Get ready." Jozef paused, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where are we going? What do you want from me?" The conductor tilted its head, the shadowy void of its face seeming to widen into a grin. "What you want, Mr. Whitmore, comes at a price, and the price grows steeper with every step you take." Before Jozef could react, the train halted, screeching his balance. He lost his stance once again as the conductor disappeared in the darkness. All that was left was a faint, mocking laugh he had left behind. The door of the carriage slid open, and wind came howling, bone-chilling cold. Jozef stepped out upon the platform, and his breath was visible in the refrigerant air. The sign above read, "The Valley of Evershade, 1701. The station was a ruin, overrun by thorny vines that writhed like living things. Across the platform stood a desolate valley lit by perpetual twilight. The very faint glow of lanterns dotted the landscape, casting eerie shadows that danced unnaturally. Jozef's footsteps crunched against the frost-covered ground as he ventured forward. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, broken only by distant, ghostly wails. He couldn't tell if they were carried by the wind or if they were coming from the valley itself. As Jozef entered the valley, the whispers started once more. This time, it was not the bad rumors from the passengers, but voices that seemed strangely close. "Jozef, why did you leave me? I waited for you. I called for you. You promised you'd never abandon me." He stood in his tracks, his blood freezing. "Eleanor?" he called out, trembling. "Is that you?" The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. He turned in every direction, but there was no one there, only the shifting shadows cast by the flickering lanterns. "Jozef." The voice was closer now, almost right behind him. He spun around, and his heart nearly stopped. Standing before him was Eleanor, or what was left of her. Her once radiant face was gaunt and pale, her eyes sunken and lifeless. Her lips moved, but the words that came out were twisted, echoing as if spoken by 100 voices at once. "You left me," she whispered, her hand reaching out toward him. Jozef stumbled backward, shaking his head. No, this isn't real. You're not real." She moved closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Do you love me, Jozef? Do you love me still?" "Yes, I do," he shouted into her face, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I'm here to save you, of course." Eleanor's face contorted in a grotesque parody of a smile. "Then prove it," she hissed. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist like an iron vise. The ground beneath their feet gave way, dragging Jozef into an abyss. When Jozef opened his eyes, he was no longer in the valley. He stood on some kind of vast, flat expanse, and above him the sky was a churning maelstrom of red and black. Before him, 3 figures stood, hooded and dark and faceless. "Jozef Whitmore," one of them said, its voice like the rumble of distant thunder. "You seek to save what is lost, but to do so, you must face your truth." A mirror appeared before him, its surface shimmering. "Look," the figure commanded. Jozef hesitated, but the mirror seemed to pull him in, forcing him to confront the image within. What he saw made him recoil in horror. It was himself, standing over Eleanor's lifeless body. His hands were stained with blood, and his face twisted with rage and despair. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not true. I didn't." "Denial will not save her," another figure said. "You have carried this guilt with you, but you refuse to face it. Now you must choose. Accept your truth or condemn her to eternal suffering." The mirror cracked, its surface shattering into jagged shards. Each shard reflected a different scene, memories, nightmares, and distorted visions of the past. Jozef fell to his knees, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The whispers returned, louder than ever, each one pulling him in a different direction. "You can't change the past. It's all your fault. Save her. Let her go." He clutched his head, screaming, "What do you want from me?" "What am I supposed to do?" The shadows closured in. Their voices became one deafening roar. "Choose, Jozef. Will you face your guilt, or will you let her die?" With feeble hands, Jozef took hold of the largest fragment of the mirror. As the touch of his fingers reached its length, a blinding light enveloped him, and the ground beneath splintered. The light faded, leaving Jozef standing in a space unlike any that he had ever encountered. It was not a room nor a void, but something between existence and oblivion. The air shimmered as if alive, the ground beneath his feet beating faintly with a rhythm that seemed to mimic some sort of heartbeat. He breathed unevenly, gazing around. The glass shard he had touched had vanished, but the cold remained on his palm. The whispers were now silent, deafening silence that felt heavier than any sound. There, a faraway glow pierced the darkness. The pulsing of this light coincided with the rhythm of the earth. Jozef found himself walking toward it by some unseen force. It came before him as a door tall and imposing, with the most intricate carvings, which seemed to shift and writhe under his eyes. An inscription was at the center. To open the door, one must unearth the truth. Jozef extended, his fingers grazing the door's surface. Cold, yet alive, it vibrated slightly under his touch. A deep voice rumbled from the ether, resonating within his very soul. "Do you seek salvation, Jozef Whitmore?" "Yes," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I need to save her." The voice laughed, a dark, guttural sound that sent shivers running down his spine. "To save her, you must understand her fate. Are you prepared to bear the weight of truth?" Jozef gulped, his heart racing. He nodded firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes." The door groaned open, and his icy blast swept over him. Ahead of him, a stair curled downwards to an abyss. Steps hewn in some glittering material, like obsidian, so cold at every step it took him. The staircase seemed endless. He began hearing faint sounds while descending murmurs, cries, and laughter, all blurring into an odd cacophony. The walls started shifting, revealing scenes from his past, as if in some macabre theater. He saw himself and Eleanor on their wedding day, with radiant faces filled with joy. But the scenes continued downward, darkening. Arguments, betrayals, and moments of doubt played out before him, each one stabbing at his heart. "Why are you showing me this?" he screamed into the void. The voice returned, colder and sharper. "Because you refuse to see. You cling to a lie, Jozef Whitmore. Now, you must confront it." At the bottom of the staircase, he came upon a cavernous room. The walls were covered in an endless amount of mirrors. Each reflected a different version of himself, young and free, old and broken. Yet each stared back at him with accusatory eyes. In the center of the room, a stone pedestal stood. On it lay a leather-bound book, its pages dimly lit. As Jozef reached out to it, the air grew heavy, settling upon him like an unseen weight. "Open it," said the voice. Jozef trembled as he opened the book. Its leaves were full of words and images that pulsed with life. They told not only his memories but his thoughts, the fears that had been breeding in the dark recesses of his soul, with which he could not cope. One page in particular caught his attention. Eleanor was lying in a darkened room, her face pale and lifeless. Jozef was there too, standing over her, his hands stained with blood. "No," he whispered, recoiling. "That's not what happened. I didn't—" The mirrors around him shattered simultaneously, their shards swirling into a vortex. The voice thundered above the chaos. "Do not deny what lies within your heart. You were there. You chose this path." Jozef went to his knees, sobbing. Long-buried memories come flooding back. He remembered the fight, the pleading for him to stay, the boiling of his anger. He remembered the accident, the blood, the guilt that had locked in his chest like a crushing vice ever since. The shards coalesced into one figure, Eleanor. But this was not the Eleanor he knew. Her form was ghostly, her eyes dark voids that seemed to pierce his very soul. "You left me," she said, echoing with grief and rage. "You let your pride destroy us." "I didn't mean to," Jozef cried. "I loved you. I still love you." "Love!" she spat, her form flickering. "If you loved me, why didn't you save me? Why did you let me die alone?" Jozef reached out to her, but she stepped back. "What can I do? Tell me how to make this right." Eleanor's expression softened, but her eyes remained dark. "You cannot undo what's been done, but you can choose how this ends." She waved at the pedestal. That's when she transformed the book into a dagger, its blade shattering from another world's light. "For me to be free, you should lose your soul. Choose to live, and I'd never ever get out of this cave, forever lost in emptiness." Jozef stared at the dagger and processed the words. He would sooner carry the weight of guilt and sin than lose Eleanor altogether. "What will become of me if I decide to save you?" he asked softly. "You'll become part of the train," she said. "You'll be an eternal passenger, lost in the nothingness. But I will be free." Jozef's eyes closed. His heart was heavy. He felt they should have shared moments, a life, and a future that was brutally taken from them. "I'll do it," he said, taking the dagger. "I'll free you." Eleanor's shape brightened, her ghost face smoothed into the woman he loved. "Thank you," she whispered. With one last breath, Jozef plunged the dagger into his chest. As life seeped from Jozef, the room around him melted into light. Eleanor laughed, pure and sweet, as she shifted into the air. Jozef woke up to find himself back on the train. The passengers had disappeared, and the carriages were silently empty. He walked along the train, his footsteps echoing in the silence, till he reached the engine room. There, the conductor was waiting for him, its shadowy form. "Welcome, Mr. Whitmore," it said. "Your journey has just begun." The train started moving, hurtling into the vast emptiness. Jozef settled by the window, looking out at the darkness. He was no longer a man looking for redemption, but part of the train itself, a guardian of its secrets and tied to its endless path.